It was 11 in the morning when the sound came, not like thunder, not like engines, like something ancient being torn apart. The sky over southern Japan had been cloudless for days, blue like porcelain. Mothers were hanging clothes. Children were chasing shadows on the wall. Some old men were sitting quietly near the market, too tired to talk about war, or God, or death. And then came the scream of metal, low, long, relentless. The first Mustangs appeared like silver knives, slicing the air open. They were not dropping bombs, not yet. They were flying low enough to see faces, to read expressions, to remind everyone on the ground that they had nowhere to run. In a small village near Kagoshima, a girl named Satoe dropped a bucket of water when she heard them. Her brother Tetsuo froze, his rice ball halfway to his mouth. They had heard the stories. But stories did not have shadows this large. Stories did not have eyes. What no one told them was that the Mustangs were more than just airplanes. They were symbols, engines of superiority. The final act of a theater that had gone on too long. Sleek, agile, lethal. They could fly for hours, sweep over cities, and erase what remained of resistance. No siren sounded in time that day. No military defense reached the sky. The Mustangs had arrived before the warnings could. People always remember the bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, but few remember the weeks before, when the sky itself was taken away. One Mustang after another pierced through the air like a message. You are not in control. We own the daylight now. Mothers clutched babies as the winds from the aircraft made curtains dance violently inside their homes. Dogs barked at the horizon. Old women whispered prayers with shaking hands, uncertain whether they were asking for forgiveness or simply an end. Down below, the silence that followed each flyover was worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that sinks into your bones, the kind that comes when even hope knows it has been defeated. In those early hours, nothing was dropped. No fire, no destruction, only presence. And that was enough to break something sacred. For centuries, the sky had been the realm of gods, of dragons, of peace. Now it was an open wound. And the Mustangs were not just aircrafts. They were the handwriting of surrender, written in vapor trails. Children stopped looking up. It was not safe anymore. Looking up made it real. That night, Satoe's father sat by the small radio, waiting for orders, news, hope. What he heard was static, the kind that hides fear between frequencies. She watched his face harden as he turned the knob left, then right, hearing only the nothingness that sounded like a scream nobody wanted to admit. By the next morning, the village had changed, not in rubble, not in blood, but in posture. People walked smaller. The local teacher, once proud and loud, now kept his head down. At the market, prices changed, not because of scarcity, but because the future had evaporated. No one needed eggs when tomorrow was uncertain. What they wanted was time and silence. Across the island, similar scenes played out. The Mustangs dominated from Okinawa to Tokyo. They swept through industrial zones, coastlines, rural farms, escorting bombers, cutting off escape, making sure everyone remembered that resistance would only cost more. There is something especially cruel about knowing that your enemy sees you and chooses to let you live. That kind of mercy is a form of control. It says we could destroy you, but we don't need to. Not yet. That was the message of the Mustang flights, a warning louder than any explosion. In the north, stories emerged of trains being targeted. Civilians said the aircraft chased them across bridges. Survivors described the roar of the engines like the sound of steel folding. One farmer said he saw a Mustang dip its wings in a mock salute before unleashing its fire on an empty field. It was not just war, it was performance, a demonstration of absolute dominance. By the end of the week, people started drawing blackout curtains earlier. Families avoided open fields. School was suspended, not because there had been damage, but because people understood that damage was no longer the goal. Psychological warfare had arrived in its most refined form, and it wore a star on its wing. A 62-year-old widow named Tomiko, who had lived through the firebombings in Osaka, whispered to her neighbor, "I fear this more." Back then, we had fear of flames. Now, we fear the silence between the engines. And it was true. There was no chaos, only design, a kind of invisible ink rewriting the rules of survival. The sky, once untouchable, had become a battlefield you could not enter, only endure. The Japanese military, once proud of its Zero fighters, had little left to offer. What remained of its air force had been outclassed in range, speed, and firepower. Every time a pilot left the runway, it was as if he were flying into a grave already dug. The Mustangs waited like hawks, circling. Every engagement became a lesson in futility. For those on the ground, the shift was not just military, it was spiritual. Shrines stood untouched, but the belief in invincibility crumbled like old wood. The emperor's voice had not yet spoken to his people, but many already knew the outcome. You do not fight gods with swords. And from the way those planes flew, with precision and grace, they might as well have been celestial messengers, declaring an end to arrogance. Some said it was beautiful, the way they moved, how the light bounced off their wings, like silver birds singing a song that only power understands. Others said it was the ugliest thing they had ever seen, because it reminded them that beauty in war is not a comfort, it is a weapon. If you are still here, still watching, still listening, I want to ask something. Leave a comment with the word sky. Subscribe to this channel, not just for history, but for memory. Because these stories are not about war. They are about what war steals quietly, while pretending it is just passing by. This was not just an attack. It was a message, and it echoed in every village, every city, every heart that looked up and realized the sky no longer belonged to them. Before the sky was taken, before the sound of engines became the voice of fear, there was a girl who still believed in the rhythm of ordinary days. Her name was Satoe Tanaka. She lived in a wooden house with sliding paper doors and a cracked radio that hummed louder than it spoke. At 13, she had never been kissed. She had never seen a foreigner. She had never imagined a world beyond her rice field, her street, her sky. Her village sat quiet on the southern edge of Kyushu, surrounded by slow hills and the scent of smoke from morning cook fires. There were no theaters, no factories, just a temple, a school, and a few shops that sold dried fish and sugar when the military allowed it. Her mother's hands were always red from washing clothes. Her father walked with a limp from an old injury that the army said was not important enough for a pension. Her siblings were shadows she looked after more than played with. When the war began, her father had cheered. There was pride in his voice, in his posture, in the way he tied his sandals. He believed in victory, believed that Japan had a destiny, that the emperor was divine, that sacrifice was noble. Satoe barely ate at the meal. Time had clapped because her mother told her to. But as the years passed, the cheers turned to silence. Rice grew thinner in the bowl. School days shortened. The boys disappeared one by one, not because they had failed, but because they had been chosen. The older girls learned to sew parachutes with trembling fingers. Satoe learned to lie when her youngest brother asked where their neighbor's house had gone. One evening, the local teacher, who used to sing poems by heart, gathered the children. Under the shrine tree, he asked them to write letters to the soldiers. Letters of strength, letters of loyalty. Satoe remembers folding the paper slowly. She wrote, "Dear brother soldier, do not die. Come back to us. We are waiting. We are proud." But when she tried to sleep that night, her chest felt empty, like she had placed her heart on the page and sent it somewhere she would never see again. Her first encounter with real fear came not from the Americans, but from her own country. One morning, a man in uniform came to her house and told her mother to report for work at the military depot. She had never worked outside the home. She cried when they left. She came back weeks later, thinner, quiet, with burns on her wrist she never explained. After that, Satoe stopped asking questions. The village was not bombed, not yet, but they felt the war like a second skin. Whispers filled the air like smoke. They said the army had stopped sending reinforcements. that the hospitals had no medicine, that the Americans were not just soldiers, but monsters. People were told not to listen to enemy broadcasts, not to read hidden newspapers, not to speak anything that did not sound like obedience. Sometimes, Satoe watched the sky and wondered if it remembered who it belonged to, because on the ground, everything was being taken. Then came the sirens, not the loud ones from cities. These were old metal drums hit by hand. They meant American planes were near, and with them came silence. Not just in the air, but in people's eyes. Her father stopped looking up. Her mother stopped singing while she worked. Her brothers stopped laughing. She remembers the first Mustang that flew overhead, not because it attacked, but because it didn't need to. It passed slowly, arrogantly, like it knew that fear was more efficient than bullets. Its shape was unlike any other, shiny, sharp, like something from another world. That night, her mother cried alone by the stove. She was making soup from water and bean paste. Her hands shook. She whispered, "We have nothing left to give." And in that moment, Satoe realized that surrender was not something that happened in newspapers or on battlefields. It happened in kitchens, in silence, in broken gestures. The next day, the village headman made an announcement. All children over 12 were to be trained in emergency response. Satoe was handed a bamboo spear. It had no sharp point. It was more symbol than weapon. She practiced stabbing straw targets that did not bleed. They told her she was protecting her home, but in her heart, she knew it was a lie meant to fill time. One afternoon, her class was brought to a cleared field to dig trenches. It was hot. Her fingers bled. A girl fainted. The instructor said, "Weakness is treason." Satoe believed him. That night, she washed her hands in salt water to numb the pain, afraid that if she cried, someone might hear and think she had betrayed the emperor. She kept a notebook hidden under her mat. In it, she drew the faces of her family, not how they were, but how she wanted them to be, smiling, whole, together. She never showed it to anyone. That notebook was the only place where she could still tell the truth. And then came the day when everything changed. The day the Mustang didn't just fly over. It circled. It returned. It dropped something. Not a bomb, not fire. A leaflet. A small square of paper with English words she couldn't read, but the picture said enough. A city. In ruins. A child. Alone. A mushroom cloud behind him. That night, she hid under the table with her siblings, holding them like shields. Her father stared at the leaflet. His hands were shaking. He said, "I think the gods have left us." Somewhere deep inside her, a small voice whispered that maybe the gods had never been there to begin with. If you felt this in your chest, like memory echoing through time, let us know in the comments. Tell us your thoughts. Share your voice. And if you believe these stories matter, that remembering is its own kind of justice, subscribe to this channel now. There is more that needs to be heard. The sky had not fallen, but in hearts like Satoe's, it had already shattered. Satoe had begun to count the days by silence, not by sunrises or school bells, but by how long it took for the ground to stop trembling after a flyover. Some days, she measured time in seconds between distant explosions. Other days, in the hours it took for her mother to find something edible in the garden. Behind the house, time had shifted. It no longer moved forward. It circled, like the aircraft above them. Her brother Tetsuo had stopped asking questions. Once curious, once full of games and nonsense, now he mostly watched. He watched the radio for voices. He watched their father for expressions. He watched the sky for what it might take next. The Mustangs had grown bolder. They flew lower, slower. They were no longer just military instruments. They were declarations. They owned the sky. They flew with such precision that it was hard to believe any human was controlling them. Some villagers began to whisper that the Americans had found a way to put spirits into metal. Others believed the gods of the sky had switched sides. And Satoe, still 13, still learning how to carry silence, began to understand something terrible. The Mustangs were not here to kill her. They were here to remind her that her life could be taken at any moment. In the nearby town of Minamata, a school was mistaken for a factory and hit with strafing fire. 17 children died. Their desks burned before their names could be erased from the attendance book. No apology came, no acknowledgement. Only another wave of planes, another morning of shadows, another night of dreams that ended in screaming. She did not know those children, but she felt their absence like a hole in the air, a weight pressing against the ribs. Something had shifted after that. The teachers stopped giving lessons. The IB principal turned the school building into a shelter. Books were torn apart to make bedding. Ink pots were emptied to create blackout paint for the windows. And still, the sky sang. One afternoon, Satoe was walking with her mother near the vegetable stalls when she saw a strange man standing perfectly still near a wall. He was not a soldier. His face was tired, his clothes torn. He held a small notebook and stared at the clouds as if waiting for something. Her mother whispered that he was from Tokyo, a survivor, one of the few who had seen the city after the firebombing. He never spoke, only wrote in that notebook, every day, same time, same place, as if trying to remember something he had no language for. Satoe wondered what he saw when he closed his eyes. In her own home, the tension was growing. Her father had changed. The pride in his shoulders had collapsed into a slope of silence. He no longer recited news from the front. He no longer spoke of glory or sacrifice. Instead, he asked where the scissors were, whether the rice was soaking. He began to ask small questions, the kind that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with surviving one more day. There was a moment, one night, when the radio came alive. An announcer spoke with urgency. American troops had landed, somewhere south, close, too close. The house fell into darkness, not from the blackout, but from fear. Her mother whispered a prayer she had not spoken in years, and then her father, eyes locked, on the radio, said something Satoe would never forget. "It is not death that scares me anymore. It is living through what comes next." From that moment, her body never felt the same. Food tasted like ash. Water seemed colder. Her hands, once quick and soft, now trembled when she held them out. She began to wonder if she would ever see spring again, if cherry blossoms would ever return to the school courtyard, if laughter would ever echo without guilt. The news from the cities grew worse. Reports whispered their way through the village like disease. Bombings in Fukuoka, bombings in Nagasaki, strange illnesses, people burning from the inside. The elders said this was a curse. Others said it was science beyond reason. Either way, the children stopped asking where the airplanes came from. They only asked where they would go next. One morning, she found her neighbor, Mrs. Takahashi, kneeling in the dirt, tearing fabric into strips. Not for sewing, for wrapping, bandages. She had lined them up carefully. Her son was missing. He had gone to the front. That was all she knew. She told Satoe that hope is a dangerous thing when it stays quiet for too long. Satoe nodded, though she was not sure what that meant, but she would remember it, just like she remembered the sound of metal screaming overhead, just like she remembered the way her brother slept with his shoes on in case they needed to run at night. By the time the Americans dropped their leaflets again, warning civilians to flee, no one had the strength to move. Most did not understand the words. Some believed it was a trick, others knew it was real and simply closed their eyes. Satoe kept one of the leaflets. She hid it between two pieces of fabric under her floor mat. It showed an image of a city in flames. There was no blood, no bodies, only a sky torn open by light. At the bottom, printed in bold black letters she could not read, was a message. Years later, she would learn what it said. "Leave. You are not the target, but you are in the way." It was the first time she realized she had been standing in the way of something bigger than she could name. Every day after that, she watched the sky with new eyes. She no longer searched for birds. She searched for warnings, patterns. Anything that might mean danger was near. Her innocence had been traded for instinct, and instinct said the end was coming. There are things a person never forgets. The smell of burnt tatami, the sound of boots running on gravel, the moment when a body freezes not from cold, but from knowledge. And for Satoe, It was the moment she realized that surviving would mean carrying everything she saw into a life where no one wanted to talk about it. Not long after, she stopped drawing in her notebook. If these memories resonate with you or stir something you cannot name, leave your words in the comments, even if it is just a thought. And if you believe these stories carry weight beyond history, beyond dates and maps, subscribe to this channel. Let us remember what it cost to survive a war you did not ask for. Because in that village, under that sky, a 13-year-old girl was beginning to understand that silence was not safety, it was surrender. The morning after the broadcast, Satoe noticed something that had not been there before. Silence had a shape. It wrapped itself around the house like fog. Her father no longer sat by the radio. He just stared at it, as if waiting for it to speak on its own. Her mother no longer folded clothes with precision. She moved as if her bones had become too heavy. The stillness was not calm. It was the kind of silence that only comes when people realize they have been abandoned by those they once trusted. Rumors had turned into truths, not because someone confirmed them, but because nobody denied them anymore. The war was lost. That much was clear. But what remained unclear was how far the government was willing to go to pretend it wasn't. In the nearby village of Sendai, a Baidii family was taken away in the middle of the night. Their son had been caught listening to foreign radio frequencies. He was 17. His mother screamed so loudly that the sound echoed across rice fields. People kept their doors shut. That was the rule. When fear visits someone else's home, you do not watch, you do not speak, you pray. It does not knock on yours next. At school, the principal stopped holding morning assemblies. The flag was lowered, but not folded. No one played the national anthem. Instead, the children were gathered to copy loyalty slogans in silence. Obedience is honor. Endurance is victory. It felt hollow, like trying to light a fire with wet paper. One day, Satoe's teacher called her aside and gave her a small bag of dried seaweed. He told her to keep it hidden and use it only if she got separated from her family. She looked at him and asked where she would go. He didn't answer. He just nodded, as if the question was too big for words. That same week, men in uniform returned to the village. Not soldiers from the front, but officials from the home ministry. They didn't look like warriors. They looked like accountants. Their task was not to fight, but to monitor morale. They met with the elders, took notes, asked questions that sounded like statements. They wanted to know who was still loyal, who was asking dangerous questions, who might be spreading doubt. Everyone understood what that meant. In Japan, you did not need to be accused to be punished. Being suspected was enough. Being tired was dangerous. Being too quiet meant you were thinking, and thinking, in a time of blind obedience, was the first crime. Satoe overheard one of the officials saying that anyone who resisted would be labeled a sympathizer. She didn't know what that word meant, but the way her mother's hands stopped moving when she heard it made her understand it was worse than enemy. The village prepared itself. Trenches were dug. Wells were sealed. Girls were told to cut their hair and carry blades in their sleeves. Better to die than be captured, they were told. Better to be ashes than shame. It was not a metaphor. It was a policy. Some families received pamphlets explaining how to use oil to burn themselves and their children in the event of invasion. Satoe read those instructions with frozen hands. The letters looked like they belonged to a different language, a language that had stopped believing in life. At night, she listened to her parents whispering. Her mother wanted to leave, go to the hills, disappear. Her father refused. He said if they ran, they would be seen as traitors. If they stayed, they might survive. She asked him how survival could still mean anything. He didn't answer. In the darkness, her youngest brother wet himself. He was 7. Her mother had no change of clothes to offer. She just held him and sang a lullaby so quietly it sounded more like a farewell than comfort. One of the villagers, a retired naval officer, decided to speak up. He had once been celebrated. Now, he stood in the temple courtyard and shouted that the war was over, even if the emperor refused to say it. He said they were all being lied to. that the Mustangs in the sky were not warning shots. They were mercy. He was taken away that same evening. Nobody ever saw him again. The next morning, the temple bell did not ring. Its rope had been cut. Satoe walked past it and felt something shift inside her. She began to understand that truth was no longer something spoken. It was something hidden behind silences, behind missing people, behind slogans painted on crumbling walls. When she returned home, she found her father staring at an old photo. He was younger in the picture, wearing a soldier's uniform, standing proudly beside two men who had not come back. He said nothing, just handed her the photo and asked her to keep it safe. That night, their neighbor Mrs. Sakamoto set her house on fire. They said it was accidental, but everyone knew her. Husband had been labeled a risk. He had once worked as a translator. The fire took her and her two daughters. The smell lingered for days. No one spoke of it again. Days later, a letter arrived, stamped with military approval, short, cold. It said that Satoe's uncle had died in action. No location, no body, no explanation. Her father took the letter and folded it 3 times before placing it under the radio. Then he picked up a knife, not to use, but to clean. The sound of metal scraping wood was the only sound in the room. Her mother whispered that grief had become a ritual without ceremony. Satoe started having dreams, not of war, but of things that had been lost. Her old school desk, the scent of her sister's hair, the shape of rain falling on rooftops. The dreams ended before she could speak in them, as if memory itself was cutting her short. One evening, she found a small package wrapped in cloth near the entrance to her home. Inside was a piece of candy, a single square. No note, no name. Her mother burst into tears, not because of fear, but because someone still remembered kindness. That night, they cut the candy into 4 equal pieces and ate in silence. It tasted like another life. If you are still here, still listening to this story, let it live a little longer. Leave your thoughts in the comments, even if it is just a word. Subscribe to this channel if you believe some truths are too important to be buried. Stories like this are not about sadness. They are about the courage it takes to carry what cannot be spoken. Because sometimes survival is not about escaping. It is about refusing to forget. The field where the Mustang fell had once been used for rice. Now it was scarred, darkened by burned grass and crushed earth. Smoke still curled into the air like a ghost unwilling to leave. When Satoe first saw it from a distance, she thought the plane was only sleeping. A massive silver bird resting in a strange position, one wing bent, the other still, trying to touch the sky. No one ran toward it. No one shouted. The village watched from far away, frozen in a kind of stunned reverence. For so long, the Mustangs had been untouchable, always above, always invincible, and now one lay broken on their land, silent. It was her brother Tetsuo who moved first. He took 2 careful steps forward, then stopped, as if expecting the machine to come alive again. When it did not, he walked closer. Satoe followed, her heart beating so hard she thought it would give her away. With every step, the smell of fuel and hot metal grew stronger, mixing with the sharp scent of smoke and soil. Inside the broken metal shell was a man. He could not have been much older than 17 or 18. His uniform was torn, stained with dirt and blood. One side of his face was covered in ash. The other was pale, almost childlike. His eyes were open, but unfocused, searching for something that no longer existed. When he saw Satoe and Tetsuo, his lips moved, forming words they could not understand. He sobbed. It was not the cry of a soldier. It was the cry of a boy who had realized he was far from home. For a moment, nobody knew who the enemy was, the metal on the ground or the breathing boy inside it. Satoe knelt without thinking. Her hands moved on their own. She tore a strip from her sleeve and pressed it gently against the wound on his arm, where a jagged piece of metal had sliced through the fabric and skin. He flinched, but he did not pull away. They could have run. They could have called for soldiers. That was what they were supposed to do. That was what loyalty demanded. But in that instant, all Satoe saw was another young life trapped in something too big for him to understand. They dragged him into a nearby storage shed, hidden by tall grass and broken wood. They gave him water with trembling hands. He whispered something again and again. A name, perhaps, or a prayer. They did not know. But the sound of his voice filled space, turning fear into something else, something strangely familiar. For 3 days, they hid him. During the daylight, Satoe would sneak out to find small pieces of food, a handful of rice, a dried root, a sip of rainwater collected in a barrel. At night, she sat near him, watching his chest rise and fall. Each breath felt like a secret. He tried to speak more than once, pointing to his chest, then to the sky, then to Satoe. He was trying to tell her who he was, what his world looked like on the other side of the ocean. He drew with a piece of charcoal on the dirt floor, a house with a tall roof, a woman with long hair, a dog beside a tree, snow falling from above. It was the first time Satoe had ever seen snow. In that dark shed, with the smell of burned metal still clinging to their clothes, something impossible happened. The enemy was no longer a shape in the sky. He was a person who hurt, a person who missed home, a person who could die. But war
allow moments
does
like
not
that
to last. On the fourth morning, voices approached. Japanese soldiers searching the area for remains, for proof, for victory. They were not gentle men. They carried anger in their boots, in their breathing. They had lost too much to feel mercy. Tetsuo panicked first. He was only a boy. He wanted to save the pilot, but feared losing everything else. Satoe felt her body freeze, then move. She stepped outside the shed and raised her hands, pretending she had only just discovered the wreckage. The soldiers pushed her aside and found him. The pilot looked at Satoe one last time. There was no fear in his eyes anymore. Only questions, only sadness. They dragged him away. No one in the village spoke of what happened after that. No one asked. In a world built on silence, questions were dangerous. But for Satoe, the image of that boy never left. It followed her through every moment that came after. In the way her mother stirred soup, in the way the wind touched the sky curtains, in the way the sky grew quiet at dusk. Years later, when people spoke about the cruelty of the Americans, she remained silent. When they spoke about the heroism of Japan, she remained silent too, because she had seen something no one else wanted to admit, that there were victims on both sides of the sky. That night, she took out her small paper flower, the one her sister had made long before the bombs and the fear, and she placed it next to her pillow. For the first time in weeks, she cried without making a sound. If this moment touched you in a way that words cannot fully explain, write something below. Even a simple thought is enough. And if you feel these stories matter, if you believe memory deserves a voice, take a second to subscribe and stay connected here. Because in one small village, beneath a broken wing of metal, a quiet understanding was taking root, and nothing would ever be the same again. The day the heavens went quiet was not announced with words. It came, without warning, without ceremony, like the aftermath of a scream that has finally lost its voice. For weeks, the air had been full of thunder, engines, and fear. Then suddenly, there was nothing. No sirens, no roaring metal. Only an emptiness so deep that people were afraid to breathe too loudly, as if sound itself might bring the planes back. Satoe woke that morning expecting the familiar dread to greet her, but the sky above her home was still. The clouds moved slowly for the first time in months. It felt unnatural, almost threatening. She stepped outside and listened. There were birds, real birds. Their fragile sounds filled the space that had once belonged to machines. The silence did not bring relief. It brought questions. By midday, whispered rumors had spread through the village like fragile threads of hope. A great city had been destroyed in a single flash. A weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen had turned streets into ghosts. Some called it a new sun. Others called it the end of days. The elders told the children not to listen, but children listen with their eyes, not their ears. A few days later, a voice came through the radio that had once only known static. It was the emperor. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word could shatter the ground beneath the people. Many could not even understand the language he used. It was too formal, too distant, but the meaning slipped through in a way no interpreter was needed for. Japan had surrendered. Satoe watched her father's shoulders collapse. The man who had once walked with pride now sat on the floor like a stranger in his own home. Her mother removed a small cloth that had covered a framed image of the emperor for years and folded it away without a word. No one cried loudly. Tears had lost their strength. The war was over, they said, but the air still smelled of burning. In the days that followed, American soldiers began to arrive. They walked through the remains of towns that had been vibrant only months ago. They looked young, too young to have caused such destruction, and yet their uniforms carried the weight of it. Some handed out food, others simply stared. Satoe watched them from behind the wall of her broken school. Their boots left marks in the dust of her childhood. She saw chocolate in one of their hands, a real bar, still wrapped. It looked like something from another planet. One soldier noticed her and offered it to her. She did not move. Her heart raced. It on a stone and walked away quietly. She did not eat it right away. At night, the village gathered not to celebrate, but to count. They counted the missing, the dead, the homes that no longer stood. They spoke of those who had disappeared into prisons or ashes. They spoke of people who had died not in battle, but in shame. And beneath every quiet conversation, there was the same question. Was it all for nothing? Satoe could not forget the fallen Mustang, the boy inside it. She wondered if he had lived, if he had been fed, if he had been treated as an enemy, or simply another casualty of a war that no one had chosen for him. He had become a shadow that followed her through every silent moment. She heard older men saying Japan had been humiliated, that the honor of generations had been crushed by foreign hands. But Satoe felt something else growing inside her that did not match their anger. She felt a strange clarity, a realization that the sky which had once terrified her was now nothing more than open space. It did not belong to any empire. It had never been owned. It had simply been used. One evening, she climbed the hill at the edge of her village and sat alone. The sun dipped slowly behind distant mountains that had witnessed the entire war in silence. The clouds turned gold, then violet, then faded, and for the first time in years, she felt something return to her. Not joy, but the possibility of breathing without fear. In the distance, she could see the outlines of burns and collapsed roofs. She could smell the ruins. But above it all, the sky remained untouched by human grief. That sky had witnessed lies, violence, bravery, cowardice, and the quiet strength of those left behind. Satoe reached into her pocket and pulled out the small paper flower her sister had made years before. It was worn now, its edges soft, but it had survived everything. Bombs, fire, silence. It existed where so much else had vanished. She pressed it gently into the soil and whispered something no one else could hear. It was not a prayer. It was not forgiveness. It was a promise that she would remember, not just the pain, but the truth buried beneath it. If you feel the weight of this moment, if you sense the echoes of history and memory touching something inside you, take a moment to leave a comment. Share what you felt. And if stories like this move you, consider subscribing and staying with us. Because remembering together is how healing. Down in the village, new voices began to rise. Children stepped into open spaces again. Pots clinked in kitchens. The first quiet steps of a world trying to live after falling apart. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the story that had almost ended was finding another reason to continue. Years passed the way they always do after war, quietly, in pieces, like glass swept into corners and forgotten. There were no victory parades in Satoe's village, only funerals without bodies carved into wooden boards. The occupation came and then changed shape. Americans were no longer soldiers. They were teachers, engineers, tourists, and eventually neighbors. Satoe grew older. Her hair turned gray before her first child learned to speak. She married a man who had survived the war in a camp outside Nagasaki. They never talked about what they saw, not because they didn't remember, but because remembering made it harder to live. Her home became a place of careful silence. She raised her children with patience and a kind of invisible sadness. She taught them not to hate, but also not to forget. She placed the paper flower in a wooden box and kept it in the highest shelf of her closet. Every year, on the anniversary of the surrender, she opened it and looked at it in silence. She never told them about the boy in the Mustang. Decades passed. Buildings replaced the rice fields. The old paths were paved. The temple was rebuilt, but without the original bell. Her youngest daughter moved to Tokyo. Her son opened a mechanic shop. Her husband died quietly in his sleep, holding her hand as if they had never known anything but peace. Then one day, nearly 70 years after the Mustang fell, she received a letter from a university researcher in the United States. He was collecting oral histories from survivors on both sides of the Pacific. He asked if she would be willing to speak. Her first instinct was to say no, but the envelope had included something unexpected: a photograph. It showed a group of American pilots standing beside a P-51 Mustang, smiling. On the back, a name had been written in faded ink: David L. Wilkinson. Her hands trembled when she saw it. She had not spoken that name out loud since she was 13. She was not even sure he had told it to her. Maybe he had only drawn the W in the dirt with his finger. Maybe she had imagined the rest. She wrote back. It took weeks for her to find the words, not because she did not remember, but because writing made it real again. She told them about the field, the wreck, the blood, the charcoal drawings on the floor of the shed. She wrote that she had been a child, that she had chosen to help him, that she had later let them take him, and that she had lived with that silence every day of her life. The researcher replied months later. The letter included a message from a woman named Anna Wilkinson, David's daughter. She had grown up hearing her father's story. He had spoken of a young Japanese girl who saved his life, who brought him water and covered his wounds. He had been captured, yes, but he had survived. He had spent time in a prisoner of war camp before being released. He returned home, married, raised children, and always carried with him the memory of kindness in the middle of chaos. Anna thanked her, said her father had died in 1983, said he had always wanted to return to Japan, not to fight, but to say thank you. Satoe read the letter in the same room where she had once opened leaflets warning her to run. She cried in silence, not because it hurt, but because it was no longer hers alone. After that, she began to speak, not on stages, not in documentaries, just in rooms, in classrooms, in community centers, in parks. She brought the letter, the photograph, the paper flower. She told children not to believe that war makes people strong. It only makes them quiet, and that silence is where pain grows. She showed them the drawing David had made of his home, snow, the tea, the dog, the tree. And then she showed them how he had drawn a second picture, a girl, small, with a ribbon in her hair, holding a flower. She never knew he had drawn her until she saw it in that letter. At first, people in the village were surprised to see her speaking. They had known her as quiet, kind, reserved, but she spoke with clarity now, with purpose, with something that felt like peace. She said she did not blame the planes, or the governments, or even the silence of her neighbors. She blamed forgetting. Because forgetting is not the same as healing. Forgetting allows it to happen again. One morning, she was invited to speak at a school where her grandson studied. He sat in the front row, quiet but proud. She told the students that the most dangerous thing about war is that it teaches children how to carry fear without screaming, that it teaches love to hide, that it makes sky into something terrifying. And then she held up the flower. She said this was not a symbol of death. It was a survivor, like her, like all of them, and that as long as someone remembered what it meant to hold life in your hands and choose not to destroy it, there was still hope for the world. When the talk ended, one little girl raised her hand and asked if the sky was safe now. Satoe smiled, not because she had the answer, but because the question had returned. If this part of the story brought something to the surface for you, even a memory, or a feeling you cannot explain, write it below. Your words matter. And if you believe stories like this should not fade with time, subscribe now. Join others who carry remembrance with reverence, not regret. Satoe walked home that day beneath a sky that no longer frightened her. The clouds moved slowly, the wind touched her face gently, and somewhere far above, the silence had finally changed, not empty, but open, ready to be filled with voices again. 6 months after her last public talk, Satoe stood in front of her home. It was black and white, slightly faded at the corners. In it, 3 children were smiling under a cherry blossom tree. She recognized her own younger self, her sister, Hitomi, and Tetsuo, with a ribbon tied around his head, trying to look serious, but failing. The photo had been tucked inside an old book for years, forgotten, like so many things had been after the war. But nothing was truly forgotten, not anymore. Her home was quiet now, her children grown, her grandchildren busy with lives filled with things she could never have imagined. Cell phones, trains that moved faster than birds, photographs that moved on screens, a world where the sky was no longer something to fear, but something people flew through, casually, joyfully. She sometimes sat outside in the late afternoon, watching the airplanes move slowly across the horizon. She no longer flinched at the sound of engines. Instead, she listened to them like music, like proof that life had kept going. The box with the flower still sat in her closet, but she did not open it as often now. She no longer needed to. That part of her had found peace. But she left the box where her youngest granddaughter could reach it, just in case one day she wanted to ask. Her story was no longer a secret. It had become something else entirely. A way for others to look at their own silences, their own wounds, their own histories, carried quietly in the heart, waiting for the right moment to be named. Satoe had never set out to teach. She never wanted to be seen as wise or brave. She had simply survived. And in surviving, she had discovered something that no textbook could explain. That dignity is not something people give to you. It is something you reclaim, piece by piece, even after you have been shattered. One morning, as spring began to stretch its fingers across the fields again, she visited the old school building. It had long since become a library. Children ran barefoot across the yard. She walked the halls slowly, touching the walls as if greeting old ghosts. In the corner of one room, a mural had been painted. Bright colors, blue skies, birds flying, and beneath it, written in small, careful letters, was a phrase that made her stop. What we remember, we protect. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth of the sun through the window. Not burning, not blinding, just there, like a friend. Her last conversation on record was quiet. She had been sitting in her garden when a journalist asked her what she wished people would take from her story. She thought for a long time. Then she said, "I want people to know that no life is too small to matter, that even in war, a child can choose kindness, that even in silence, there is resistance, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is live long enough to tell the truth." Her voice cracked on the last word, but her eyes stayed strong. To this day, her story is shown in classrooms and memorials, not to teach, blame, but to remind us what is lost when we forget, and what is saved when we choose to remember. And now, to you watching this, thank you for carrying this journey with us. Your time, your attention, your willingness to feel what others lived. That is how we keep memory alive. If this story touched something inside you, please consider leaving a comment below. A thought, a feeling, a memory. And if you believe stories like Satoe's deserve to be passed forward, subscribe to this channel and join others who care not just about history, but about dignity. Click on the next video that is now on your screen. There is more to remember, more voices to hear, and together we can honor them all. From the sky that once knew only fire, now we rise with grace. Thank you.